And the lesson stays. Numbers don't decide everything. Creativity does. Geography does. Refusing to quit does. 40,000 against 6,000 looked impossible. But Maria running ammunition through fire. Giovanni pouring boiling oil at 70 years old. Catherine delivering messages at 12. Jean de Valette fighting at 71 with a sword. All of them showed that impossible is just a word for what seems unlikely before someone changes the game. Malta didn't win because it had bigger numbers. It won because it refused to give up. And that's sometimes all you need. Want to see more impossible defenses that won against the odds? Check out the next video where we explore battles that broke all the rules of warfare. If this story of courage and brains inspired you, like the video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what moment of the Malta siege you thought was most amazing. Because stories like this need to be remembered. And lessons like this need to be shared. Some battles decide kingdoms. Others rewrite the entire rulebook of warfare forever. On October 25, 1415, near a village called Agincourt in Normandy, England's fate hung in the balance, not by French steel, but by mud and by wood. 6,000 exhausted English soldiers, mostly common archers, armed with nothing but wooden longbows, ranged against them. 12 to 15,000 French knights, the absolute elite of European nobility, decked out in gleaming plate armor, mounted on destriers trained to pulverize infantry. 2.5 French soldiers for every Englishman. The math was brutal. English slaughter, complete annihilation. Everyone knew it. But something impossible happened on that muddy field. Wood beat steel. The mud became England's secret weapon, and the French nobility was butchered on a scale that defies military logic. This is Agincourt. The story of how one man's tactical brilliance turned certain defeat into one of the most devastating victories in medieval history. October 1415. The 100 Years' War between England and France had already eaten up generations. Decades of conflict, endless sieges, shattered alliances, and land disputes. This wasn't just another skirmish. It was a defining moment for all of Europe. The real question wasn't who'd govern some territories. It was which nation would control the continent for the next century. King Henry V had something to prove. Young, ambitious, hell-bent on reclaiming English rights to the French throne rights that went back centuries. But his ambitions were about to crash into medieval warfare's brutal reality. The siege of Harfleur had cost more than gold and ammunition. It had cost blood, morale, and precious time. After weeks of brutal fighting, he'd finally taken the port. But his army? Absolutely wrecked. Dysentery was running rampant through the ranks, supplies were dangerously low, and winter was coming. Now, deep inside French territory with just 6,000 men, mostly archers, Henry faced an impossible decision. Getting back to England meant crossing hundreds of kilometers of hostile enemy territory to reach the safety of Calais. Staying meant facing the French response that was already gathering, and it was already forming. Imagine it. 6,000 soldiers starving, sick, absolutely knackered from weeks of marching and fighting, carrying barely anything, many barefoot, ramshackle armor, bows that had seen better days, crossing French countryside under torrential rain that turned roads into mud rivers. Every step was a fight against exhaustion. Every night brought the certainty that somewhere nearby the French were gathering, and getting stronger. The rain, that bloody rain, for days, weeks, it just kept coming. The kind of autumn rain that gets into your bones, that turns fields into sodden marshes. The English soldiers trudged through it, wading through ankle-deep muck, sometimes knee-deep, equipment rusting, morale in freefall, and every single day word came down. The French were close, really close, and there were loads of them. Because France didn't just have soldiers, it had Europe's most feared cavalry. French nobility bred for mounted warfare since childhood. Men covered head to toe in forged plate armor, tipping the scales at 50-60 kilograms. Mounted on destriers' massive war horses, also partially armored. This was medieval warfare's ultimate weapon. A fully equipped French knight was a mobile fortress, an absolute force of nature. Once he got a full gallop going, nearly unstoppable. And France had thousands of them. 12 to 15,000 soldiers, mostly heavy cavalry, led by Constable d'Albret, the top French commander. Nobles who'd waited their whole lives for this kind of glory. A chance to crush an English invasion, to capture or kill a king, to write their names into history with the blood of common archers. French confidence was more than warranted. It was simple maths. 2.5 Frenchmen for every Englishman. Cavalry against foot archers. Steel against wood. Trained nobility against peasants with bows. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution waiting to happen. Everyone knew it. The French weren't even debating if they'd win. They were arguing over who got the glory of the first charge, who'd capture Henry V, how much ransom each English noble would be worth. The English knew it too. On freezing wet nights, camping in muddy fields, they talked about their odds. Basically none. Some prayed. Others wrote letters they knew would never be delivered. Most just accepted they'd die here on French soil, miles from home, beaten by forces they couldn't overcome. But Henry V wasn't having it. While marching his men toward Calais, his mind was racing. He understood warfare, he understood tactics, and he knew that brute strength wasn't everything on a battlefield. There was terrain, there was position, there was psychology, and there was that bloody mud. When English scouts finally spotted the French blocking the path to Calais near Agincourt, Henry V made a decision that changed everything. He wouldn't retreat. He wouldn't try going around them. He'd fight, but on his terms, at his location, using his tactics. He picked his ground with surgical precision. A narrow field, hemmed in by 2 thick forests. Maybe 300 meters across, nothing more. This was critical. In open terrain, the French cavalry could swing around, sweep in from the sides, use their numbers to surround the English completely. But in this narrow corridor, they'd have to come straight at him, in tight waves, right into the arrows. And that mud, that brilliant, deadly mud. Weeks of rain had turned the field into a proper bog. The kind of ground where a knight on foot would sink to his shins with each step. Where a horse carrying tons of steel would sink to its knees. The kind of terrain that would turn a cavalry charge medieval warfare's most lethal weapon into a slow-motion horror show. Henry V positioned his archers, 5,000 of them, 83% of his entire army. He stretched them in a long line across the narrow field, with infantry in the middle to handle any cavalry that broke through. Then he ordered something genius. Stakes, sharpened wooden stakes, driven into the ground at an angle pointing toward the enemy. A forest of deadly points protecting every archer position. These stakes were simple, just sharpened wood, but brilliant. Horses won't charge into a spike wall. They naturally slow down, veer sideways, scatter the formation. And even if a knight got past them, he'd be moving at a crawl exactly when the archers needed sitting ducks. Easy kills. The English plan was complete. Narrow terrain to nullify the French numbers. Mud to wreck cavalry momentum. Stakes to scatter formations and protect the archers. And 5,000 English longbows, each firing 10 to 12 arrows per minute. 50,000 arrows every single minute. An absolute storm of wood and iron falling from the sky. But plans on paper and actual battle are entirely different beasts. The French saw no tactical genius, only desperation. English troops trapped, refusing to run, making a pathetic last stand. Perfect. Crushing them while they were dug in would just make it more glorious. October 25th, 1415 dawned cold, damp, and gray. Mist clung to the muddy field. On one side, the French army, gleaming in polished armor. Banners flying, horses pawing the ground, nobility radiating confidence. On the other, the English, filthy and ragged, kneeling in the mud, kissing crucifixes, whispering prayers. They looked beaten before a single arrow flew. The French nobles were arguing, not about tactics, about rank. Who charges first? Who gets the honor of smashing the English? Who captures the king? It was almost laughable. Such confidence, such arrogance. Such absolute certainty this would be easy, legendary, glorious. On the English side, Henry V moved among his men. He spoke to them, reminded them why they fought. Home, England. St. Crispin, whose feast day it was, October 25th. He told them that any man who didn't want to fight could leave. No one budged. They'd stay, not for glory or conquest, just because they had nowhere else to go. The English archers drove their stakes further into the mud. Checked their strings, counted their arrows. 12, maybe 15 per man. Not much. Would have to be enough. Their hands shook. Not from fear, from cold, exhaustion, hunger. But when the moment came, those hands would steady. Those fingers would draw strings with the strength of a lifetime's practice since childhood. Those bows would fire with brutal accuracy. The space between the two armies was about 400 meters. Heavy, deep, treacherous mud everywhere. On the French side, thousands of knights mounted up. The noise was deafening, metal clanging, horses stamping, officers shouting orders, banners rising. Then the French moved, not carefully, not with good tactics, with pure arrogant confidence. The cavalry started moving, trot first, then gallop. The earth shook, actually shook under the weight of thousands of tons of steel and horseflesh hitting that muddy field. On the English side, the archers stayed silent, waiting. Bowstrings taut, arrows knocked, eyes locked on the cavalry mass approaching. Henry raised his hand. Not yet. Hold on. Let them come. Let them sink in that mud. Let them get to perfect distance. The mud was doing its job. Before a single arrow flew, the mud was wrecking the French charge. Horses that should have been at full gallop were fighting, sinking, stumbling. The formation supposed to be an iron wall was falling apart. Knights shouted, whipped their horses, tried keeping momentum. But physics doesn't lie. Weight plus mud equals catastrophe. And then the French charged. But this wasn't thunder from the sky, it was iron, steel. 1,000 warhorse hooves pounding soaked earth. The French charge had begun. Picture the sound. Not like the elegant gallops in films, this is visceral, metallic. Each knight carried 40, 50 kilos of plate armor. The horses in steel carried another 300 kilos of dead weight. Multiply that by hundreds of knights charging at once, and the ground shakes. The air vibrates. It's the sound of death getting very close. And the French knew it. Look at their confidence right then. They'd done this hundreds of times. The cavalry charge was medieval warfare's ultimate weapon. No infantry ever survived the impact. No archers ever stood against armored horses charging at 40 kilometers per hour straight at them. The French weren't nervous. They were buzzing. This would be quick, glorious, a complete rout. On the English side, the archers watched that wall of steel racing toward them. 5,000 men, mostly peasants and common folk, with wooden bows against Europe's military elite. The contrast was absolutely brutal. Steel versus wood, nobles versus regular people, power versus what? Hope? Smart tactics? Desperation? Henry V had gambled everything on three things. First, the terrain. That narrow field between forests funneled the French charge, preventing them from using their numbers effectively. Second, the wooden stakes. His archers had planted thousands of sharpened stakes angled forward, creating a simple but deadly barrier against horses. Third, the mud, that bloody mud from weeks of rain, and it was the mud that started changing everything. For the first 100 meters, the charge kept its momentum. Hooves hammering, knights yelling commands, lances forward. The formation was impressive, deadly, unstoppable. But then physics kicked in. 40 kilograms of armor plus 300 kilograms of armored horse plus 15 centimeters of thick mud equals a mathematical nightmare. The lead horses started sinking. Not dramatically, not like in films, but enough. The gallop became a plodding trot. The trot became a struggle. Animals meant to be at full speed were just fighting to stay upright. And the formation started breaking apart. Knights at the front slowing down forced those behind to rein in. Others tried going around, hunting for better ground, but the whole field was a mud trap. Horses stumbled, knights swore. That solid steel wall was becoming scattered groups fighting the terrain itself. Within 100 meters of the English, the French charge had lost what made it deadly. Speed, momentum. The crushing impact that was supposed to smash the English? Gone. Instead of an iron avalanche, the French were dragging themselves through swamp. Vulnerable, exposed, slowing by the second. And right then Henry V gave the signal. The 5,000 English archers raised their yew-bows, long wooden weapons, simple, primitive compared to French polished steel. But these weapons had something armor didn't: range, speed. And now, with French cavalry stuck in mud less than 100 meters away, something even better: sitting ducks. The first volley was a different kind of thunder. Not metal vibrating wood. Strings unleashing stored energy. 50,000 arrows cutting air at once. That's what happens when 5,000 archers, each firing 10 to 12 per minute, release a coordinated volley. 50,000 arrows every minute. Get your head around that number. Not a metaphor, not exaggeration. English archers were professionals, trained from childhood. English law made men practice archery every Sunday. These archers fired an arrow every 5 seconds, hitting targets 100 meters away with lethal precision. And right now they had perfect targets. Knights in heavy armor, slogging through mud, completely unable to dodge, impossible to miss. The volley hit the French cavalry like a horizontal storm. Arrows pierced armor at that distance. Not all. Quality plate could deflect angled shots. But armor has weak points. Joints, helmet openings, armpits, neck, back of knees. When 50,000 arrows are flying, probability becomes mathematical certainty. Horses fell first, arrows in eyes, necks, exposed chests. One horse down creates an obstacle. Others trip. That formation, already torn apart by mud, completely collapsed under the wooden rain. Dismounted knights in mud, wearing armor weighing as much as a kid, struggled to stand while arrows kept raining down. The archers kept going, volley after volley. 10 arrows per minute per archer meant every 6 seconds. Another cloud of 50,000 projectiles cut the air. The sky went black with flying wood. The sound never stopped. Continuous, high-pitched, deadly hum, like a swarm of giant oak and steel bees. This was the brilliant innovation nobody expected, not the arrows or the longbow themselves, but Henry V's combination. Terrain that neutralized mobility, mud that turned cavalry into slow targets, devastating firepower concentrated in a tight space. The French had walked into a slaughterhouse dressed up as a battlefield. The second wave of French cavalry watched the disaster unfold. First line disintegrating under arrows, horses falling, knights battling mud, armor turning from protection to prison. Any sensible commander would have pulled back, regrouped, rethought it. But medieval nobility didn't run on common sense, they ran on honor and pride. Unwavering belief that aristocratic courage beat any peasant tactic. To retreat meant cowardice, shame, admitting that peasants with wooden bows were better than knights with centuries of tradition. So they charged again. Same trap, same mud, same arrow storm. The English archers, trained their whole lives for this exact moment, kept firing. Arms didn't get tired. Technique didn't slip. Quiver after quiver, arrow after arrow, volley after volley. The pile of arrows each archer had stuck in the ground was his ammo, hundreds per man. They used every single one. The third French wave arrived while the second was still falling apart. New obstacle now. Bodies. Dead and wounded horses blocked paths. Fallen knights cluttered the ground. Mud was turning red, mixed with blood, making terrain even worse. Arrows never stopped. It was a cascading tactical disaster. Every French choice made the previous catastrophe worse. Charging the same route created a pileup of bodies. Frontal charges crammed forces into a tight space. Refusing to retreat kept troops in constant fire. The French nobility was being systematically butchered by its own bloody mindedness. Then the stakes kicked in. Knights who made it through the arrow storm, survived the mud, climbed over dead mates, now faced a forest of sharpened wooden points, impaled horses, knights thrown backwards. The last English defense line made of the simplest material imaginable worked perfectly. But some Frenchmen got to the archers. Of course they did. Hundreds of elite knights, Europe's best fighters. Some always break through. When they arrived, combat became primitive, brutal. Archers dropped bows and grabbed axes, hammers, knives, tools for close combat with armored opponents. You can't cut through plate armor. But you can crush it, pierce joints, drive a man into mud, and suffocate him with his own armor's weight. And the mud became the star again. French knights in full armor, once knocked down, couldn't get back up. Weight, exhaustion, sticky mud kept them pinned. English archers lighter, nimbler, more desperate, had a massive advantage in close combat in these conditions. Constable d'Albret, top French commander, died in that chaos. Not in a glorious duel, not heroically charging, but in Agincourt mud, surrounded by common soldiers, his magnificent armor now a death trap. France's military elite was literally drowning in mud and blood. Hours went by, not minutes, hours of constant fighting. The casualty gap was obscene. Hundreds of English wounded or dead bad, definitely. But the French? Thousands. Elite knights, nobles with famous names, commanders with decades of experience, all piled in red mud near Agincourt. The English archers eventually ran out of arrows, so they used the French's own arrows stuck in bodies, shields, ground. Free ammo from the enemy, ironic, brutally efficient. As the sun dropped toward the horizon on October 25th, 1415, the impossible was happening. The English weren't just surviving, they were winning. Decisively, completely, absolutely. 6,000 exhausted, starving, sick soldiers had destroyed a French force 2.5 times bigger. Wood beat steel. Tactics beat numbers. Mud became the battlefield's most lethal weapon. The field was covered in dead. Not scattered piled. In places 3-4 layers of bodies. French aristocracy decimated. Not figuratively, literally. 1 in every 10 French nobles died at Agincourt. Dukes, counts, commanders, future leaders, all leveled by mud and English peasants' arrows. When silence finally fell, when the last French knight was captured or had run, when the last arrow flew, the English archers stood looking at each other in absolute shock. They'd survived. Against all odds, all logic, all Europe's most powerful forces, wood beat steel. But not just the wood. It was the mud, terrain, tactics. Henry's refusal to fight conventionally. French arrogance charging repeatedly into the same trap. The combination that turned mathematical impossibility into historic victory. When the sun set over Agincourt on October 25th, 1415, something fundamental changed. Not just the Hundred Years' War's outcome, but medieval warfare itself. Armored cavalry's supremacy was broken. The English longbow proved its lethal value. The idea that superior numbers meant certain victory, shattered in Normandy's mud. When silence fell over Agincourt, it was stunning silence. Not peaceful. The silence of men in shock, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. The battlefield looked like a nightmare. Thousands of French bodies sunk in mud, piles of dead horses. Steel armor that gleamed gloriously at dawn was now covered in blood and mud, turned into metal coffins for men who'd worn it so confidently. The English archers walked among the dead in absolute disbelief. They'd survived. Against all the maths, all military logic, Europe's best cavalry, they shouldn't be breathing. Yet there they were, exhausted, covered in blood, but alive. The sun was dropping on October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, a day remembered for centuries. Not just as a battle, but the day medieval warfare's fundamental rules got rewritten in Normandy's mud. Then the numbers started coming in, and they were staggering. About 200 English soldiers dead. 200 out of 6,000 men. 3% casualty rate. Unbelievable on any day. Miraculous given what they were up against. The French. 6 to 10,000 dead. 10,000 out of 12 to 15,000. 40 to 66% casualties. Devastating. Incomprehensible. Catastrophic. The maths was brutal. 30-to-1 casualty ratio. 30 Frenchmen dead per fallen Englishman. This wasn't a victory. It was a massacre. Historic scale. A massacre that shattered conventional warfare logic. And not just regular soldiers had died. French nobility decimated. Constable d'Albret, France's top commander, dead. Duke of Alençon dead. Count of Never dead. 90+ other senior nobles dead or captured. France's military elite wiped out in one afternoon. This wasn't just a tactical loss, it was strategic decapitation. French military leadership got wiped out in one blow. The effects would echo for decades. But how? How'd wood beat steel so completely? How'd 6,000 exhausted men shatter 12,000 fully armored knights? How'd the mathematically impossible become historically certain? The answer was 3 factors converging. Each alone wouldn't have been enough. But together, they created the perfect storm. First, the mud not just an inconvenience. It was a weapon. French steel armor weighed 20 to 30 kilograms. Add weapons, shields, full medieval kit. Now stick all that in deep mud. Mud that grabbed every step, turned every movement into a battle with physics, converted speed to slow motion, turned mobility into a trap. Steel, which should have been the French's big advantage, became their ruin. The heavier the armor, the deeper the knight sank. More he struggled, more energy burned, more vulnerable he got. Protection became dead weight. Advantage became a fatal problem. Second, the English longbow, but not just the weapon, the deployment tactic. Henry positioned 5,000 archers in a specific formation, protected by wooden stakes angled into the ground. Stakes that stopped direct cavalry charges, forced the French into a narrow space between forests, created a perfect kill zone. Then the archers opened fire 10 to 12 per minute per archer. 5,000 of them, 50,000 arrows per minute from the sky. A volume of fire no armor could survive forever, especially with targets practically frozen stuck in mud, can't dodge. Perfect sitting ducks. Wood arrows, bows, stakes. Simple technology, hundreds of years old. But deployed with deadly precision, optimized for battlefield conditions, transformed from a hunting tool into an engine of mass military destruction. Third, the terrain. Henry's deliberate choice. The narrow field between forests denied French their numbers advantage. Forced compression, prevented flanking, turned 12,000 into a tight mob with no room to move. And the mud, which Henry saw as the game changer. He knew it would neutralize French cavalry's mobility, gambled it would give his archers time to shoot, kill, win. Henry didn't just fight a battle, he turned the battlefield into his weapon, used physics, geography, weather as tactical allies, refused conventional warfare's rules, rewrote them in his favor. The combination? 3 factors converging? Lethal, unbeatable, pure tactical genius. The French charged with confidence, belief in superiority, certainty of victory. Then they got slaughtered. Not cowardice, not incompetence. They were fighting rules Henry broke, relying on doctrines he'd made obsolete, believing superior numbers and tech guaranteed victory. Henry proved them catastrophically wrong. Agincourt's strategic impact echoed far beyond the battlefield. 5 years later, in 1420, the Treaty of Troyes got signed, giving Henry IV succession rights to the French throne, making him France's heir. Impossible without Agincourt. The victory established English tactical supremacy beyond question, proved the English could not just survive superior French forces, but annihilate them. Changed the Hundred Years' War's balance of power fundamentally. France was forced into defensive strategies, avoiding direct battles with the English, accepting that their armored cavalry, the pride of their nobility, was vulnerable, that tactics and terrain beat numbers and armor. Agincourt's military legacy. It lasted decades. The English longbow became Europe's dominant infantry weapon. Its tactical superiority was validated as dramatically as possible, 30 dead Frenchmen per Englishman. You can't argue with those numbers. Agincourt taught a lesson military minds still study. Technology plus tactics plus terrain beats numbers. Ingenuity beats brute force. Adaptation beats rigid doctrine. The commander who sees the battlefield as an integrated system, not just a stage for fighting, gets a decisive edge. Medieval war doctrine got permanently changed. The idea that armored cavalry was invincible, shattered in Agincourt mud. That superior numbers guaranteed victory, annihilated by 6,000 archers. That steel always beat wood, reversed by 50,000 arrows per minute. Agincourt was absolute proof, bloody, unquestionable proof that brains beat brawn, strategy beats size, that the commander who thinks differently, refuses conventional rules, transforms disadvantages into advantages through creative thinking, achieves the impossible. Which brings us to Agincourt's real lesson. The one that transcends military history, applies to any impossible odds situation. Henry was cornered, exhausted, 1/6 the enemy's strength, sick, hungry, desperate. By all logic, he should have been annihilated. But he refused conventional logic. He looked at his disadvantages and asked how to turn them into advantages. The mud? Everyone saw a problem. Henry saw a weapon. The narrow space? Everyone saw a limitation. Henry saw an equalizer. His troops' fatigue. Everyone saw a weakness. Henry compensated with superior positioning and preparation. He took every element that should have guaranteed defeat and turned it into a victory tool. Not luck, strategic genius. Refusal to accept the inevitable. Insistence there's always a way if you think differently enough. When the battle ended, when the impossible was real, when wood shattered steel and mud drowned knights. The message was crystal clear. Smaller forces beat larger forces. Limited resources overcome abundant resources. Disadvantages become advantages. But only if you've got the tactical smarts to see beyond the obvious, the guts to do things differently, and the discipline to execute flawlessly. Agincourt was more than a battle. It was a statement. Ingenuity beats brute power. Creative thinking beats mathematical odds. The leader who grasps the complete system, not just individual pieces, can reconfigure the whole game in his favor. October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day. The day steel bowed to wood, mud became a lethal weapon, 6,000 men proved numbers don't determine destiny. Tactics do. And that's the promise fulfilled. Steel versus mud? Steel lost because Henry weaponized mud. Slaughtered by wood? Absolutely 50,000 arrows per minute created a 30-to-1 casualty ratio. The French nobility? Decimated by relying on obsolete doctrine against a commander who rewrote the rules. Agincourt wasn't